She buried her husband with empty arms and a heart full of silence. 20 years passed. Then, one morning, 15 children stood at her gate, cold, starving, and calling her ma'am. The first knock didn't come with fists, just the soft clatter of wood against metal, like someone too weak to know how hard to ask. Ada Quinn lifted her head from the stove where the flame struggled low and quiet, embers just barely biting at the dry kindling. She wasn't expecting anyone. No one ever came this far, and hadn't for 20 years. Outside, the wind rolled like an empty wagon over sand. Dust scuffed the edge of the windowsill and the chimney spat dry air instead of smoke. Ada reached for her shawl anyway, tucking the frayed edge beneath her elbow as she crossed the cabin floor. Her knees cracked, louder than the knock itself. She paused before opening. Then she did. And what she saw made her breath vanish. 15 children, ranging from barely walking to maybe 16, standing in a crooked line, some clutching one another, some staring at their boots, some too dazed by sun and hunger to know where they were. The oldest stepped forward, a boy with a split lip and one eye swollen shut, and held out a bundle that looked like it might have been bread a week ago. "Ma'am," he said, voice hoarse and dry, "we ain't thieves. We just need somewhere to sit a while." Ada didn't speak. She counted them again. 15, all of them filthy, one barefoot, one holding a crying toddler that wasn't her own. She had no words, just a strange, hollow ache rising up from beneath the ribs she thought had stopped hoping long ago. Then the smallest child, a girl no bigger than Ada's porch stool, took a step forward and whispered, "Please." Ada stepped aside. They didn't rush in. They moved like ghosts, quiet, careful, as if they might be turned away at any second. The oldest, his name was Levi, he'd said later, carried the littlest one in his arms. 3 boys carried an older girl who couldn't walk, and Ada just stood in the doorway as the silence returned to the desert, now thicker, heavier. She hadn't spoken in almost a year. Not since the last letter from the township said the train wouldn't be coming through anymore, and the doctor had died out by the canyon pass. She hadn't seen another soul since the peddler last traded salt for lamp oil 2 summers back. And she hadn't thought of children, truly thought of them, since the day they buried Jacob in the red clay hill behind the house, when the preacher placed a hand on her shoulder and said God's will sometimes comes with empty cradles. But now her front room was full of them, 15, sinking onto the floorboards and chairs and every scrap of blanket she could pull from the cedar chest. She moved like a woman possessed, water on the stove, flour scraped from the barrel, a tin of beans she'd saved for winter, opened without hesitation. Not one of the children spoke while they ate, but their eyes tracked her, quietly, as if trying to guess what she might do next, as if unsure whether they'd be told to leave once the food was gone. Ada finally cleared her throat, voice rough from misuse. "Where you from?" A pause. Then Levi spoke. "West, but there ain't nothing west anymore." Another child said, "Our wagon caught fire." A third added, "We been walking since the river dried." No one said whose children they were. Ada didn't ask again. By nightfall, the wind picked up, humming against the windows. She lit every lantern she had. The children, now bathed in warm light and wrapped in every stitch of linen she owned, lay scattered like fallen stars across the floor. Ada stood in the doorway, watching them breathe. And she cried for the first time in 20 years. Not loud. Not for long. Just enough. Just long enough to remember what silence used to feel like before it turned into grief. The next morning, the sun came up pale and still. Dust shimmered over the hills like tired gold. Ada had always begun her days alone, with the stove and the rocker and Jacob's grave in the distance. But now her porch held a different kind of weight. Footsteps. Children. Life. And in her chest, something moved that she hadn't dared to name in decades. It was a beginning. Not one she asked for. Not one she would have believed possible. But still, something had shifted. She looked out at the scrubland, barren as ever, and said aloud to no one in particular, "Guess we'll need more bread." Inside, Levi was trying to boil water. The girl with the limp was helping fold blankets. A boy sat drawing shapes in the dust with a twig. Another braided Ada's worn curtain tassels like it was the most natural thing in the world. And in that house, under that roof, where silence had once slept like a second ghost in every corner, there was laughter. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. Enough to begin something new. By the end of that first week, Ada Quinn had learned all 15 names. She wrote them down in a ledger Jacob once used for cattle counts, printing each letter slowly so she wouldn't forget. Levi was the oldest, barely 16, a boy too thin to cast much shadow and too worn to remember what safety felt like. Then came Elsie, who'd once walked upright before her ankle had been broken by a runaway ox cart, or so Levi said. She rarely spoke, but she helped. Her fingers were quick, steady. She sewed like she'd been born, with a needle in her palm. The rest came like tides, clinging to each other in pairs or threes, brushing past her skirts in the kitchen, trailing behind her in the garden, which hadn't grown anything but disappointment in 10 years. There was Peter and Ruth, twins with big brown eyes and a secret language of shrugs and smirks. Lyle, who never stopped watching the horizon like someone was coming. Mabel, who sang under her breath and braided everyone's hair in the same crooked way. Jack, sweet-natured and slow-moving, who clung to Ada's hip the way she imagined a child might to their real mother. Each night they made pallets out of flour sacks and blankets. The cabin had once seemed wide and echoing, built for a family that never came. Now it bustled like a church before Sunday service. The floor creaked from motion. Doors stayed open. Laughter came in small bursts, tentative, then bolder. The silence was still there, but not so heavy. It had to make room now. Levi never said where the rest of the adults had gone, or who the children truly belonged to. He just thanked Ada every night, quiet and gruff like a man 50 years older than his bones, and made sure the younger ones didn't cause trouble. Ada didn't press. She de-learned through long winters and dry years that some truths didn't need prying. If they wanted to speak, they would. If not, she'd still feed them. But one night, long after the others had drifted off to sleep, Levi came to her porch with his arms crossed and his voice thin. "I think they mean to come looking." Ada sat up straighter in her rocker. "Who?" "The ones that sold us. Not all the grown-ups died when the wagon burned. Some ran off, some stayed behind, but a few," his jaw clenched. "They wanted to sell the little ones. Some already were." Ada felt something cold settle in her stomach. "And you?" "I waited until they weren't looking. Took all the ones I could." He looked down at his feet, ashamed of something he should have been proud of. "Figured we'd keep going till someone said stop." Ada rose, went to the stove, poured 2 tin cups of tea, and handed one to him. Her hand brushed his. "Well," she said softly, "you made it to stop." He looked up at her, something shifting in his eyes, and she thought, maybe just for a moment, he looked like a boy again. They didn't speak more that night. But when Ada turned the lantern low, she placed Jacob's old rifle by the door for the first time in years. Just in case. That winter came hard and early. Snow fell in sheets, and the wind howled like something half alive across the plains. Ada had never shared the bed she and Jacob built. But one night when the temperature dipped below freezing and the youngest, Emmy, couldn't stop shaking, Ada pulled her into bed and told the others to pile in too. By morning, she was blanketed in warmth. Dozens of small limbs tangled around her like ivy. And for the first time in 2 decades, she woke to the sound of breathing not her own. There were struggles. The roof leaked during the second storm. One of the boys, Reuben, got fever and nearly passed. Food ran low, not out but close. Still, none of them ran. And Ada never sent them away. The snow turned to mud. The mud turned to grass. By spring, they'd learned to grow things again. Mabel coaxed life out of the garden. Peter and Ruth dug a trench for runoff. Levi and Lyle patched the barn roof using old fence wood. Ada watched it all, sometimes with a strange weight in her chest she couldn't name. Pride maybe, or fear, or both. Then one night, as the stars blinked wide above them and the air held the scent of new growth, a man rode up the trail. He didn't knock, just dismounted slow and steady like he knew where he was, and wasn't surprised to see the house lit, full, alive. Ada stood on the porch with Levi beside her. The man tipped his hat, face shadowed. "Evening," he said. Ada's voice came firm. "You lost." "No, ma'am." He looked past her toward the window where one of the children's faces blinked back. "I believe you've got something of mine." Ada didn't blink. "I've got 15 someones. Not a one of them belongs to anyone but the Lord now." The man's jaw tightened. "I was told they were here." "Then you were told wrong." She placed her hand lightly on the doorframe. "Unless you're offering help or food, I suggest you be on your way." He didn't move, just stared. Then his gaze shifted to Levi. "I remember you," he said. "You pulled a knife on me in the canyon, took a girl off my wagon." Levi didn't speak. The man took a step forward. Ada reached inside the door. Her fingers touched cold iron. She pulled the rifle from its hook, leveled it low but steady. "You take another step and I'll bury you next to the fence post." He froze, stared at her hard, then smiled sharp and cruel. "You think they're safe here?" "No," she said plainly, "but they're not afraid anymore, and that's worth something." He tipped his hat again, but this time mockingly. "You've made yourself a nest of trouble, miss, and I don't imagine it'll end quiet." Then he mounted his horse and rode into the dark. Ada did lower the rifle for a long time. Behind her, Levi let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "That was him," he said. Ada nodded. "I know. You think he'll come back?" Another pause. "I hope he does," she said. That night she didn't sleep. Not because of fear. Because of purpose. She hadn't had one in so long. Now it beat steady inside her like a war drum. She had children to protect. And a life worth keeping. The next morning came with no sound but wind in the chimney and spoons tapping against bowls. The children ate without speaking, sensing the air had changed, though few of them understood why. Ada moved like usual, measured steps, soft words, but her eyes flicked to the door too often. She checked the latch 3 times before dawn and had moved Jacob's rifle closer to the hearth, cleaning it while pretending to polish the kettle. Levi saw. He didn't say a word. But when he went out to chop wood that morning, he made sure to stack it high against the windows on the north side, just in case. By the second week, they'd all felt the shift. They learned to keep their shoes near their bedrolls, keep the door bolted even when the sun sat high. Ada started walking the perimeter of the cabin every evening, a quiet patrol no one asked about. She'd come back with wind-chapped cheeks, a folded map in her apron pocket, and a fire in her that hadn't burned this hot since she buried Jacob beneath the stone cross by the sycamore. Peter and Ruth grew quiet again. Elsie moved faster, nervous. Even Mabel stopped humming. But Ada didn't waver. She taught them to keep going even when fear set in, especially then. By mid-March, their little cabin began to look less like a refuge and more like a fortress. Wooden planks sealed cracks in the siding. Window slats were reinforced. And behind the barn, Levi had dug 2 long trenches where he said water might flow or people might fall if things got bad. "Ada," Mabel asked one day, sitting cross-legged near the root cellar where carrots were stored, "are we in trouble?" Ada looked up from her planting. "No, darling, we're in a world that's made for wolves, but we've got too many hearts to feed to be afraid of teeth." Mabel didn't quite understand it, but she smiled anyway and went back to tying bean vines. And then the letters came. The first one arrived in a neat envelope, carried by a courier boy on a bay horse. He'd ridden up smiling until he saw the rifles stacked on the porch, then handed the note over with shaking fingers and turned right back around. The message was short, typewritten, signed in red wax. "Return what you've taken, or more will be taken from you. You have until the next full moon." Ada read it aloud, then burned it over the stove. Levi stood by the window and said nothing. But that night he didn't sleep. He sat on the porch with Jacob's rifle in his lap and watched the stars pass by, one by one. 3 days later, another message came, this one nailed to the barn door. Ada found it in the morning, blood smeared across the bottom edge, though whether it was from man or beast she couldn't tell. The letter carried no words, just a single line drawing, a cabin surrounded by flames. She didn't call the children to see it. She just tore it down and buried it beneath the ash tree. But she didn't sleep that night either. Inside the cabin, the youngest children began to pick up on the dread. Emmy started wetting her bed again. Jack refused to speak for 3 days. Even Levi, hardened as he was, flinched when the wind pushed too hard on the shutters. But Ada did not allow fear to dictate her steps. Every day she cleaned, baked, planted, taught them to write, to chop, to hammer, to defend. She taught them how to take care of each other. "You can't always wait for someone else to protect you," she said one morning as she showed Lyle how to sharpen a blade. "Sometimes you have to be the person you wish would show up." And then one night, just days before the full moon, Elsie came running from the well. "Riders," she gasped, "3 of them heading this way." Ada moved fast. "Levi barn, Mabel take the littles to the root cellar. Peter, Ruth boards for the window, now." No shouting, no panic. She handed Levi the rifle, took up Jacob's shotgun herself, closed the shutters, latched the door, and then they waited. The hoofbeats came slow and deliberate, like they knew each step was being listened to. Ada peeked through the slat in the door just as the first rider appeared in the moonlight, dressed in black, face half covered, eyes cold as stone. He dismounted, knocked once on the porch beam, not the door, and waited. Ada didn't open. He knocked again. Then said, "Ma'am, I know you're in there. I know what you're keeping." Ada didn't move. "I ain't here to hurt children," the man continued, "but I was paid to bring them back, simple as that." Still nothing from the cabin. "You open this door," he said, "and we talk. You don't, and this gets noisy." Inside, Levi gripped the rifle so hard his knuckles blanched. Jack whimpered. Emmy buried her face in Mabel's lap. Ada lowered her eyes for one heartbeat, then stood straight. "Lyle," she said softly, "open the back hatch, go to the creek, follow it east. Don't stop until the sun rises." Lyle hesitated. "Now," she ordered. The boy took off. The moment the back hatch clicked shut, the man on the porch seemed to hear it. He stepped back and barked a single word. "Go!" The explosion of noise was instant, splintering wood, a window smashed in, boots pounding across dirt. Gunfire erupted from the back where Levi had repositioned. He shot once, twice, hit someone because there was a scream. Ada braced herself as the front door cracked. Then silence. Too quick. She stepped forward, shotgun raised. And stopped. The man stood inside the shattered doorway, bleeding from his arm, fury in his eyes. But he wasn't alone. Behind him stood a second man, holding Elsie by the arm. "She was at the well," he growled. Ada's face changed. Her eyes burned. The man smirked. "Still want to pretend this is your fight?" Elsie didn't cry. Didn't even tremble. She looked at Ada, calm as sunrise, and said, "It's mine too." That was all Ada needed. She fired. Smoke filled the air. Screams followed. Children scattered. It was chaos, guns and fists and broken glass. But through it all, Ada didn't fall. She fought like someone who had waited her whole life to defend something worth bleeding for. When the last shot was fired, 3 men lay in the dust. Levi stood over one, breath heaving. Ada knelt beside Elsie, checking her pulse, still strong, still steady. The cabin was bruised, broken, but standing. Like all of them. No one died. But no one would ever forget. The next day, they buried 2 men out by the sycamore. The third had crawled off into the night. They didn't chase him. Didn't need to. Let the world know. Let the wolves whisper. There was something sacred on that land now. And it would not be taken. Not without a fight. The cabin stood battered but still. The shutters were cracked, the porch torn up by bullet holes and boot scrapes, the front door barely hanging on its hinges. But it held. And inside, so did they. Mabel's hands trembled as she stitched up Levi's shoulder, the bullet having grazed him when the third man made a final desperate shot before escaping into the night. Levi didn't flinch. He kept his eyes on the children, while Ada sat with Elsie, brushing dust and blood from the girl's cheeks and checking for breaks. No one asked if the men would come back. They all knew they would. But for now, the world was quiet. And that was enough. Levi spent the next day reinforcing every inch of the cabin. He and Peter took what was left of the barn's planks and nailed them over the windows, double thickness this time. Ruth helped Ada boil down resin and layer it between boards to seal out wind and sound. Mabel kept the younger ones close, never letting Emmy or Jack out of arm's reach. The root cellar had turned from food storage into a sanctuary of sorts. Blankets lined the walls, candles were kept ready, water barrels topped off. And still Ada moved like a woman chasing time. She knew they didn't have much of it. Every hour after sunset, she paced the perimeter. One night, Peter followed her. She didn't say anything when she saw him, just handed him her lantern and kept walking. He matched her steps until they'd made it twice around the cabin, then stopped by the well. "I'm not scared," he said after a long silence. Ada looked at him. "You should be." "I'm not scared for me," he said. "I'm scared for you." She softened just a little. "I've buried more than most boys your age have even known," she said, "but I've never fought for something like this. Not before you." He nodded. "Then we fight together." And they did. The children trained in pairs now. Mabel showed Jack how to carry water in silence. Ruth taught Emmy how to wrap herbs for fevers. Levi sharpened nails and tied them to planks to set beneath the porch. Ada built a second hidden hatch beneath the hearth, barely wide enough for 2 of the smallest to crawl through, but just deep enough that it might matter. But it wasn't just preparation. There were moments that shimmered between the worry, moments that reminded them why they were fighting at all. Like when Elsie sat on the cabin floor and sang to Emmy, soft, wordless tunes that sounded older than the desert itself. Or when Peter taught Ruth to carve her name into wood, her eyes wide as the letters took shape beneath her thumb. One morning, Levi returned from checking traps with a rabbit so large they all gasped. They roasted it over a fire, and for the first time in weeks, the air filled with the sound of laughter. That night, Ada let herself smile. She remembered a time 20 years earlier when Jacob had set a pie to cool on the windowsill just because she'd told him she missed the smell of her mother's kitchen. That memory stayed with her as she watched these children sleep, scattered across her floor, their breaths deep and even. She knew then she'd burn the world down before she let another soul take them. But the world didn't wait. It came back sooner than expected. 2 weeks later, the dog barked. Not a bark of warning, no growl, no snarling, just a strange, uncertain sound that made Ada look up from her sewing. A horse, not galloping, trotting, a single rider. She stepped to the porch, rifle ready, and watched as the figure approached. Dusty hat, long coat, saddle bags heavy on both sides. The sun cast him in silhouette until he drew near enough for her to see the white hair tucked beneath his collar. "Miss Wren," the man said, tipping his hat. "Or is it still Wren?" Ada stiffened. "Who's asking?" He dismounted slow, careful. "My name's Hart, Samuel Hart. I knew your husband." Ada lowered her gun an inch but didn't blink. "Lot of men knew Jacob." "But not many buried beside him," Hart said. That stopped her. "What do you want?" He looked past her, at the windows boarded up, at the children peeking through cracks. "I came to help," he said. "And because those men that came for you, they're not done. They're part of something bigger." Ada stared at him. "I don't know you," she said. "You knew my brother," he said, "and he died trying to protect something too." That night, after long talks and longer silence, Samuel Hart stayed. The children didn't know what to make of him. Emmy clung to Ada's apron and refused to speak when he entered. Jack glared like a wild pup guarding his den, but Hart didn't press. He offered stories instead. Sat on the porch, whittling wooden birds and telling of towns he'd seen burn and folks he'd seen survive anyway. Over time, the children softened. And so did Ada. Because Hart came with more than stories. He came with maps, names, and the truth. The men who tried to take the children weren't just slavers or outlaws. They were part of a trade ring, powerful, funded, connected from one side of the plains to the other. And someone had sent them with a price, not for all the children, for one. "You're saying one of them's worth something to them?" Ada asked one night. Hart shook his head. "I'm saying one of them is someone." He unrolled the parchment across her table. "Names sound familiar." Ada read it. Slow. Then blinked. Elsie's full name. Not the one she gave. The one Ada had only seen once, carved into a stolen locket Elsie wore hidden beneath her dress. Elizabeth Margaret Vanrow. Hart nodded. The Vanrows are one of the oldest families east of the Rockies. Old money, old secrets. That girl disappeared 3 years ago. Ada felt her pulse climb. "She doesn't know," Ada said. "She doesn't need to," Hart replied. "But the men who do, they're not giving up." The next days blurred. Ada told no one. She watched Elsie more closely, seeing now what she'd missed before, how the girl never spoke of her parents, how she flinched at the mention of carriages or silk, how the locket never left her skin, not even when she bathed. And then, one morning, Hart was gone. Just like that. No note. No sign. Only a trail of hoofprints leading west. The children searched for him. Called for him. But he was gone. And with him, Ada's sense of the edge. She knew the wolves were circling again. But this time, they weren't just coming for the children. They were coming for history. And for blood. And the only thing standing between them and that legacy was her. The moon hung low that night, swollen and veiled in cloud, casting a ghost light over the sand as if even the desert held its breath. Inside the cabin, Ada Wren sat beside the fire, her hand wrapped tight around a mug gone cold. The children were asleep, most of them. She could hear Jack stirring now and then, the boy dreaming loud like always, mumbling things he'd never say in daylight. Ruth slept closest to the door, curled like a cat beneath a heavy quilt. Peter and Levi lay shoulder to shoulder, both too proud to admit they kept watch even while dreaming. But Elsie sat awake. Not near the others. Not near Ada. But on the stairs, halfway up to the loft, staring at the locket in her hands. It glinted in the firelight, dull from the oils of her fingers but still bright enough to catch Ada's eye. "You never take it off," Ada said softly. Elsie didn't startle. She just ran her thumb over the engraving, delicate scrollwork so finely etched it must have been done by a jeweler's hand. "I thought if I kept it on, maybe I wouldn't forget," Elsie whispered, "but I can't remember anything worth keeping." Ada rose, set her mug aside, and crossed the room without a sound. Her knees ached more lately, but she didn't let it show. She sat beside the girl, not close enough to touch, just enough to be there. "You remember enough," Ada said, "more than most would." Elsie looked at her, eyes glassy. "Do I?" "You remembered how to help Emmy braid her hair when her hands were shaking. You remembered Jack's favorite game when he was too angry to speak. You remember how to sit quiet when Ruth needs air, and how to make Peter laugh without trying. You remember how to protect." Elsie blinked, then looked away. "I don't want to be special," she said finally. Ada nodded. "That's the problem with being born into power. Folks think you owe the world something just for existing." Elsie held the locket tighter. "I think they're coming back." Ada didn't lie. "Yes." The silence that followed wasn't fear. It was decision. That night, Ada didn't sleep. She went outside once the fire died and the wind picked up, and stood in the sand until her feet went numb. She didn't flinch when a coyote called far off. She didn't blink when the stars flickered through a veil of dust. She just stood, the cabin behind her like a heartbeat she couldn't turn away from. And then came the morning. And Hart returned. Only this time, he wasn't alone. 2 riders flanked him, both young, both armed, both with the kind of quiet edge that said they'd survived more than their faces let on. 1 woman, 1 man. Names were short, Rue and Jalen. They spoke little, ate fast, slept even less. They weren't travelers. They were soldiers, not for a flag, for something else. Hart explained over the table, while the children ate quietly in the next room. "There's no court that'll save her," he said, nodding toward the wall, knowing Elsie sat just behind it. "The Vanros won't admit she's theirs. Not after 3 years gone. Not after how she left." "She ran," Ada said. "She was taken," Hart corrected. "Then ran. No one looked. Too many enemies, too many secrets. But the men chasing her now, they're not just trying to bring her home." Ada's jaw clenched. "They want her quiet." Hart's eyes darkened. "Exactly." Jalen unrolled another map. The entire southwest region marked, routes and safe houses and names scrawled in ink that hadn't dried more than a week. "They'll come from the east this time," Jalen said, "up through Tallow Ridge. They'll avoid the main roads, too exposed." Rue added, "They won't knock, they'll burn you out." The plan formed slowly. Not to run. Not to hide. To hold. Ada wouldn't leave. The children wouldn't either. And Hart, despite the years in his bones and the ghosts in his stare, agreed. They built trenches. Set up flares. Laid traps a mile wide. The younger children were moved into the old goat pen, now fortified with boards and hay bales and 2 escape hatches leading into root tunnels. Mabel helped Emmy write goodbye letters just in case, but tore them up the same night, saying, "If I go, I'm going with dirt on my hands and not a word left unsaid." Every evening they trained. Every morning they waited. And then just after dawn on the 6th day, the first shot rang out. Not close. Not aimed. Just a message. They were here. Ada grabbed her rifle. Peter ran to the back. Levi checked the upper loft, while Ruth pushed the younger ones through the tunnel toward the goat pen. "Remember what I told you," Ada called after them. "Don't cry, don't call out. Don't move until the sun hits the gate." The children nodded. And vanished. Rue and Jalen took the flanks. Hart stood at the front porch like it was his own grave, and he decided to decorate it. The next 2 hours were silent. Too silent. Then came the riders. 7 of them, all black coats, red scarves, no insignias, no names. Ada recognized one, the man who tried to take Ruth weeks earlier. His face still bore the scar Levi had carved down his jaw. He raised a hand. "You've got something of ours," he called. Ada didn't reply. "You've got something with our name on it." he continued, "and we're here to collect." She raised her rifle. Try. Gunfire erupted like thunder. The first volley split the air, shattered wood, sent splinters into Ada's cheek. Hart fired twice, clean and quick. One man dropped from his horse. Jalen moved like shadow, ducking and rising, hitting targets from the upper loft like he'd done it in another life. Ada reloaded. Fired again. The attackers didn't retreat. They regrouped. From behind a ridge came more riders, 5 this time, fresh, well-armed. Rue cursed under her breath and called down from the barn roof, "They're flanking." Ada shouted to Peter and Levi, "Hold the west line." Then everything blurred. Smoke filled the yard. Fire licked at the fence. Ada shot one man off his saddle, ducked as another bullet grazed her shoulder. Hart fell near the porch, bleeding from the side but still conscious. Ruth dragged him inside. Peter screamed from the barn, hit but alive. Jalen and Rue pushed back, forcing the attackers to retreat toward the ridge. And then came the scream. Not from the battlefield. From underground. From the goat pen. Ada's heart dropped. She ran faster than her body allowed, faster than thought, and yanked open the hatch. It was Elsie. Gone. The tunnel empty. A hole clawed open at the far end, fresh dirt, footprints, one too small, one too large. Ada didn't stop to think. She dove and vanished into the dark. The earth closed around her like a womb, tight and damp and suffocating. Ada Wren crawled with one hand on her rifle and the other pulling herself forward through the collapsed tunnel, breathing shallow to keep from coughing in the dust. The walls around her groaned with age and strain, beams creaking under pressure. But the prints were there, just ahead. Barely visible in the thin light of her lantern, one was small and staggered, the other pressed deep into the dirt, methodical. Adult. Male. Elsie had been taken. And this wasn't random. This was coordinated. Ada had lived long enough to know when danger was a beast and when it was a man with a map. Whoever dug into that tunnel hadn't done so on instinct. They'd known where the children were hidden. That meant betrayal, or worse, espionage. Someone had been watching. Someone had waited. The tunnel widened at a bend, and Ada emerged into a cavern cut by old miners decades ago. A forgotten shaft, rotted timbers drooping like the ribcage of some long-dead giant. Ada's breath fogged in the cold air. A wet trail on the floor told her the stranger had been dragging his boot, likely injured. She crept low, following it until the tunnel gave way to open desert. She emerged behind a tumble of rock, the rising sun stabbing across the plains like blades. She squinted toward the ridge. There they were. 2 figures. One slumped over a saddle, Elsie, her arms bound, her face buried in the rider's coat. The man didn't ride hard. He moved steady, like he wasn't afraid of being chased. Ada raised her rifle and took aim, but paused. Too far. Too much wind. Too great a risk of hitting the girl. She cursed under her breath and slipped behind the rocks, heading for her mare tethered in the dry brush. The saddle was already packed. She mounted with one smooth swing and rode low, hugging the ridge, following them from a distance as they descended into the canyon. Back at the cabin, smoke still lingered. The firefight had ended in victory, but not without cost. Peter was bleeding from a gash on his leg, Ruth was bruised from the shoulder down, and Jalen had a bullet graze across his ribs. Hart remained conscious, but pale. The bandage across his flank soaked through faster than anyone liked. "They took her," Ruth said through clenched teeth. "They took Elsie." Rue pulled her hair back with shaking fingers. "I thought the tunnel was clear." Peter shoved aside the table, dragging himself upright with Levi's help. "She'd have screamed," he said. "She wouldn't have gone quiet unless—" "She's alive," Hart rasped from the bed. "I saw her in the man's arms. He didn't hurt her. He just took her." "But why?" Emmy asked. Her voice was so small it barely carried. Why just her? No one answered. Because deep down they already knew. Elsie wasn't just any orphan. She was the orphan. The daughter of a disgraced dynasty. A ghost that once wore silk and diamonds, who now braided straw and carried water without complaint. Her blood meant something, to men who valued lineage over life, names over souls. She was a claim, a risk, a weapon. And now she was gone. Hours passed in the canyon. Ada tracked the rider until he entered a settlement, a border outpost that had long ago fallen off any map. Ramshackle buildings. No law, no windows with curtains. The kind of place where coin and cruelty changed hands without records. She tethered the mare outside the livery and entered slow, rifle slung over her back, hat low. Her boots echoed on dry boards. Inside the saloon, 3 men looked up. None smiled. "You seen a man come through," she said. "Tall, lean, carrying a girl too young to be his daughter." One of the men laughed. "Lady, half the men in here fit that." Ada didn't blink. She walked to the bar, dropped a small pouch of silver dust, and tapped it once. The laughter stopped. "Where do they go?" A younger man nodded toward the back exit. "Livery stable, left 10 minutes ago, took a wagon north." Ada turned and strode out, her steps hard, her grip tighter. She knew where north led. The old Vanrow estate. The place no one visited unless they had a death wish or blood ties. She followed the trail, keeping to the trees when she could, cutting across riverbeds and ravines. Hours turned to dusk. Dusk turned to dark. Still she pressed on. By midnight she spotted the manor house, ruined but proud, a silhouette of greed and grandeur forgotten by time. Lights flickered in one upper window. That's where she'd be. Ada waited. Not out of fear. Out of patience. She circled the grounds, found an old servant's entrance and slipped in through the cellar. Rats skittered. Boards creaked. She moved like wind, like memory. Each step brought her closer to the echo of voices above. "It was never about the girl," a man said, refined voice, tired but cruel. "It's what she represents, our name, our loss. You would understand if you had daughters." "She's not your property," came Elsie's voice, weak but defiant. "Everything in this house once was," the man said. Ada climbed the servant's stairwell. Through a crack in the door she saw them. Elsie bound to a chair, lip bloodied but unbroken. The man gray at the temples, a scar across his cheek, pacing like a judge passing sentence. 2 guards stood nearby. Ada inhaled, then kicked the door open. The shot took the first guard in the leg, dropping him before he could blink. The second reached for his weapon, too slow. Ada tackled him, slammed his head into the doorframe, then turned to the man. He held a knife now, not toward Ada but toward Elsie. "Let her go," Ada said. "She's not yours to save," he replied. "She was never yours to break." A pause. Then Elsie said quietly, "I choose her." The man flinched. "She's not blood," he hissed. "She's family," Elsie said. He lunged. Ada fired. The knife clattered to the floor. The man stumbled backward, clutching his side, not dead but done. Ada cut Elsie free and held her a moment longer than needed. Then they ran. They didn't stop running until the manor was a shadow on the horizon. When they returned to the cabin, the others were waiting, weary but whole. Peter limped out to meet them. Ruth didn't speak, just grabbed Elsie and refused to let go. Even Levi cried, though he turned away quick. And Ada, she just stood still, then turned to Hart. "You still got room in that field of yours." He looked toward the hills. "For all of them." The sun rose on a new day. The war wasn't over. The past hadn't died. But in that moment, with smoke no longer rising and the children safe under one roof, it felt like something had begun. Family wasn't always blood. Sometimes it was fire. Sometimes it was choice. And sometimes it was found in the place least expected. The days that followed were slow, as if time itself had paused to catch its breath after so much violence. The children returned to their chores, their laughter cautious but returning like spring after a brutal frost. Ada watched them from the porch most mornings, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she rarely finished. She had a wound in her side that hadn't fully healed, a shallow stab from the man in the manor, who'd clawed one last time before falling. She kept it wrapped tight, said nothing about the pain. It was a quiet ache she knew well, one that didn't need to be shared. Hart recovered too, but not quickly. The bullet had missed his ribs but torn through enough muscle to leave him pale and slow. Ruth helped him stand each day. Levi read to him at night, though Hart always pretended to fall asleep before the first page was done. He didn't want thanks. He didn't want gratitude. He just wanted the house to be full again. Elsie changed. Not in the ways Ada feared. She didn't grow bitter or reckless or haunted. She grew firm, calm, stronger in a way that didn't show in her shoulders but in her silence. She no longer flinched when the wind slammed the shutters. She no longer startled when boots crossed the porch too fast. But she never went anywhere alone now, and she always kept a knife tucked under her sleeve, hidden in a ribbon she wore at her wrist. She walked every inch of the land in the days that followed, mapping escape routes, noting where the goats wandered too far, teaching Emmy and Jack how to recognize boot prints that didn't belong. She never said what she was preparing for. She just did it, and Ada let her. One morning, while the children milked the goats and Hart slept in the loft, Elsie came to the porch and sat beside Ada. The silence stretched long. "Then why did you stay?" Ada sipped her tea. "Because I knew you'd come back." "No," Elsie said. "I mean all of this. The children, the pain, the work. Why not leave it to someone else?" Ada stared out across the desert. The sand shimmered in the heat, and the mountains loomed in the distance like quiet gods. "Because no one else was coming," she said. That night Ada couldn't sleep. She went to the kitchen and opened the drawer where she kept her late husband's journal. She hadn't touched it in 20 years. The pages were thin and worn, full of plans that never came true, of a ranch that was supposed to thrive, of children that never came. She read until the candle burned out. In the morning, she did something strange. She took the journal, walked out to the main yard and built a small fire. The children watched in silence. Ada said nothing, just set the book into the flames and let it burn. "What was that?" Ruth asked quietly. "A beginning," Ada said. Later that week, a man came riding in from the east. He didn't look like a threat. But neither had the last man. Ada met him at the gate, her rifle in her hand. He raised both arms, smiling. "Name S. Jude," he said. "I heard about the kids, about the woman who took in 15 orphans and told the desert to mind its manners." Ada didn't smile. "What do you want?" He nodded toward the satchel on his saddle. "I'm with a church, out of Abilene. We're building something, a school, for orphans, for girls who have never had a last name." Ada narrowed her eyes. "We don't need handouts." Jude shook his head. "It's not a handout, it's a seed." She didn't invite him in, but she didn't run him off either. He stayed 2 nights, talked to Ruth, played cards with Levi, read the Bible with Emmy and Mabel. He never asked for anything, just listened. On the 3rd day, he asked Ada again. "Would you let us help?" Ada looked at the children, scattered across the yard, chasing goats and climbing trees, and trying to stitch together the kind of life they'd never known before. Then she nodded. If they wanted. That was the beginning of something new. A year passed. The ranch grew. More children came, runaways, strays, girls no one claimed. Not all stayed, but many did. Ada built more rooms. Hart helped when he could. Peter turned out to be a better carpenter than anyone expected. Ruth became a teacher. Levi and Jack trained the newcomers how to ride, how to shoot, how to listen to the wind and know when something was wrong. And Elsie, she became the gatekeeper. She was the first to greet any new child, the last to let anyone leave. She wore the locket still, though she never opened it. She said the memories inside didn't belong to her anymore. One evening, Ada found her sitting beneath the tree where they'd buried the old goat, the one that refused to die until the storm passed. "Do you think it'll ever be safe?" Elsie asked. Ada sat beside her. "It's not about safe," she said. "It's about worth it." Elsie nodded. She understood that now. And on the 2-year anniversary of their battle they held a service, just a quiet one, heart read from the Psalms. Ruth sang. The children lit candles for those they'd lost. No names, just flames. A soft, glowing reminder that even in the deepest dark, someone had chosen to stay. That night, as the candles burned low and the wind shifted from east to west, Ada looked around the porch where 15 children laughed and fought and loved and healed. And she finally let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, the end of her story had never been the cabin in the desert. It had always been the family that chose her back. Spring came like a whisper, not with bright banners or celebration, but with the slow greening of weeds between stones and the delicate bloom of wildflowers beneath the porch steps. The land hadn't softened, it never did, but there were signs, subtle things, birds returning, rain that lasted longer than a minute. Even the wind, once full of teeth, now brushed the ranch with something like grace. It had been 2 years since the first knock on Ada's gate. 2 years since 15 children stood in her yard with empty bellies and fuller hearts than they'd ever been allowed to carry. 2 years since Ada's silence was broken, since her house went from echo to warmth, since her kitchen filled with clumsy feet and louder voices. She had a family now, not by blood but by fire and choice. Hart still lived in the loft, though he'd grown slower. The wound in his side healed stiff, and he favored it without complaint. The children respected him like a quiet monument, solid, unmovable, theirs. Every Sunday he read the good book on the porch, his voice deep and slow. Mabel would sit by his feet and hum along when he paused, always just a little off tune, always smiling like she knew something sacred he didn't. Ruth had become the soul of the house. She managed supplies, cooked meals, oversaw bath nights, and argued with the merchant in town every Tuesday to get one more sack of flour for $1 less. Her hair had grown long again, and she braided it the way her mother once did. She rarely spoke of the past, but once, when a new girl named Lydia arrived with bruises hidden behind her collar, Ruth sat with her on the porch for hours and said nothing. And somehow, Lydia cried anyway. Levi and Jack were men now, or close to it, taller than Hart, more reckless than they should have been, but steady in the ways that mattered. They taught the younger boys how to ride, how to repair saddles, how to treat a wound and stand in a fight without swinging first. Jack carved a flute from pine and played it when he thought no one listened. Levi watched over the chicken coop like it was sacred. And Ada, she hadn't changed much on the outside. Still wore that same threadbare shawl, still tied her boots twice every morning, still woke before dawn and checked the gates herself before anyone else opened their eyes. But she laughed more now. Not often and never loudly. But it came. When Emmy smeared jam on her nose. When Elsie rolled her eyes too hard at Peter's jokes. When Jude stopped by and pretended not to want another slice of cornbread. Ada would glance at him sideways, slice the bread anyway, and hand it over with that tight-lipped almost smile that had become her version of joy. Jude visited often, never stayed more than 3 days, never less than 2, always brought books or bolts of cloth or a broken toy someone in town said was beyond fixing. He always fixed it, said it gave him purpose. Ada didn't ask more. She knew better. Some men came with too many words. Jude came with his hands and his presence, and that was more than enough. One evening a letter arrived, wrapped in oilskin bearing the mark of the circuit judge out of San Marcos. Ada opened it with steady hands and read in silence. When she was done, she handed it to Ruth, then walked out to the porch without saying a word. Ruth followed, heart tight. "They want to recognize the ranch," Ruth said slowly, reading the lines again. "Officially, register it as a shelter, a school." Ada nodded once. "You gonna say yes?" Ada didn't answer. Instead, she looked out across the yard where the children ran, where the fence held, where the sun dipped low behind hills that once felt like a prison. "It won't be ours the same way anymore," she said finally. "Once it's on paper, once there's rules." Ruth lowered the letter. "It'll still be yours. You gave it to us, all of it." And it was true. Not because Ada had built it, though she had, plank by plank with sweat and bruised hands, but because she stayed when she didn't have to. Because when 15 children knocked on her soul, she opened the door. That night they voted. Around the table with cornbread and beans, with candles burning low and hands held tight. Every child, every heart, old enough to speak and brave enough to dream. 15 said yes. Ada didn't vote. But she smiled. By midsummer the schoolhouse was built. Just one room, rough planks and open rafters, but full of chalk and promise. Jude helped install the bell. Levi carved the sign. Ruth taught the first lesson with shaking hands and steel in her voice. The youngest girl, Rosie, spelled her name wrong on purpose just to make Ruth laugh. They planted a garden that year. It took all of them, day after day in the sun, hands blistered and clothes soaked through. But the dirt gave back, squash, carrots, tomatoes that never quite ripened on time but still tasted like victory. And in August, a boy came riding alone. No shoes. No name. Just a ribbon tied around his wrist. Ada met him at the gate. He didn't speak. Just held out his hand. And she took it. He never left. The ranch grew. Not just in numbers, but in faith, in strength, in the way every child who came learned to hold a hammer, bake bread, read aloud without fear. They learned that silence didn't mean danger, that laughter didn't have to be earned, that sometimes love arrived as a bowl of hot stew or a clean blanket or a light left burning in the kitchen window. Years passed. The desert stayed cruel, but the ranch didn't. Elsie came back from school in Abilene one spring, with ink stains on her fingers and a diploma in her hand. She kissed Ada's cheek and unpacked her bags like she never meant to leave again. She taught history in the schoolhouse, told stories that started with gunshots and ended in laughter. Hart passed one winter, in his sleep, peaceful, quiet. The children built him a bench beneath the willow tree and carved his name in the wood. Home, it read. One by one, the older children grew and left, some to start farms, some to study, some to wander, but they always came back, for the harvest, for birthdays, for nothing at all. Ada kept track with stones on the porch rail. Each one marked a return. The porch filled with them. And when Ada's hair turned white and her hands began to tremble, she passed the key to the gate to Ruth. Not because she was done, but because Ruth had earned it. The day Ada died, 15 grown children stood around her bed. She smiled at each one, not with sadness, but pride, because she had not failed them, and they had not forgotten her. The desert could not erase love. It could only test it. And they had passed. Together. 15 years later, the sun still rose over the same desert hills, painting them gold in the morning and rust by evening. But everything beneath it had changed. The land where Ada once walked, where her shawl caught the wind like a flag, was now a patchwork of life and purpose. The ranch, still called Ada's Gate by those who lived nearby, had doubled in size. What began as one sagging farmhouse and a prayer had grown into a haven known across 3 counties. No child left on a doorstep, no widow abandoned, no man crippled by sorrow was ever turned away. The schoolhouse had 3 rooms now, with wooden floors polished by hundreds of boots and lessons etched in chalk across every corner. The bell still rang every morning, twice for cold days, once for sun, and when it did, laughter followed like a promise kept. Ruth, older now but every bit as steady, stood at the front of the class most days. She kept her hair in a neat bun streaked with gray, and her voice had deepened with time. She wasn't just the teacher anymore. She was the head of the whole place, the one people turned to when rules needed changing, when hearts broke, when the world beyond the ranch walls pushed too hard. And it often did. The world outside hadn't softened. Children still ran from fists and fire, from bad men and worse memories. But they ran toward Ada's gate now, not just away from something. And that made all the difference. Mabel was a nurse now. She had studied in El Paso, written letters to every child at the ranch while she was away, and returned with hands trained to heal and eyes that never blinked at pain. She set up a small infirmary in the barn's old loft, the same one Hart once slept in. A plaque hung on the wall now, carved by Levi, painted by Elsie. The quiet saved me. Jack opened a blacksmith shop on the far end of the property. It wasn't much, a forge, anvil, a trough, but he worked there sunrise to sunset, shaping hinges, horseshoes, tools, and once, a cradle made of iron and elm. He never married, never left, but people said he sang sometimes when the wind was just right. Elsie ran the town library. Her laugh still echoed through the ranch whenever she visited, and she still argued with Ruth over whether poetry belonged in history lessons. She'd written 2 books, one about the early days at Ada's gate, the other about Ada herself. Both were read aloud every spring on the ranch's founding day, with all the children, new and old, gathered beneath the willow tree. Levi became a preacher, not in the traditional sense. He never built a church, never wore robes, and never asked for coin. But on Sundays, people gathered beneath the sun to hear him speak about faith, family, hope, and what it meant to belong. He spoke with dirt under his nails and scripture in his heart, and when he finished, even the wind felt reverent. 15 years, and yet some things hadn't changed. The porch still creaked the same way. The kitchen still smelled of stew and warm bread. The gate still swung open, never locked, never closed. And the house still kept a room just for Ada. No one slept in it. No one dared. But flowers were left there, candles lit, letters tucked beneath the pillow. Children too young to remember her still whispered goodnight to her door because they were taught, by Ruth, by Jack, by Elsie, that everything they were began with the woman who chose not to turn away. One summer a letter came. From back east, from a senator's office, a proposal, funding, expansion. The ranch could become a network, they said, a model, an institution. Ruth read the letter 3 times, fingers trembling slightly. She gathered the others. They sat around the same table Ada once presided over, though now it was longer, wider, surrounded by more chairs than ever before. Ruth laid the letter down. They want to take it national, she said. They want to send more children, build more homes, train more teachers. Levi nodded slowly. Sounds like a blessing. But they want to change the name, Jack said flatly. They want something modern, something that doesn't sound like one woman's porch. The room went quiet. Mabel, standing near the hearth, spoke last. If we do this, we do it our way, her way. The porch stays, the name stays, the gate stays open. Ruth looked around the table. 15 years. 15 children. Now 15 grown souls. And behind them, dozens more. They voted. Unanimous. Ada's gate would remain Ada's gate. The government would send funds, volunteers, doctors, tools, but the spirit would stay rooted in the desert, in the silence Ada broke with love. And as the years rolled on, the ranch did become something larger, a beacon, the kind of place stories were written about that reporters visited and left speechless, but the core never shifted. Because every new child who arrived barefoot and shaking was still greeted with warm stew and a soft blanket. Every child still carved their name into the porch rail. Every one of them still had to learn to plant something, anything, and watch it grow. And every spring, the bell rang a little louder. One day a woman arrived, hair graying, eyes tired, carrying a boy with a broken arm and a girl who hadn't spoken in weeks. She stood at the gate for a long time, unsure, dusted her dress, turned to leave. Ruth appeared in the doorway. Didn't ask her name. Didn't ask what happened. Just said the words Ada had once spoken to her. "You're home now, come in." The gate swung open. And the desert, for a little while longer, became something more than just sand and sky.